Hmm. Great. Right, we're on, and I'm just going to ask that if you can mute whilst until there'll be many points for joining in, but if you keep yourselves on mute until then, that just keeps everything as clear as possible. And just a heads up, one of the easiest ways to unmute on Zoom is to hold down the space bar, talk whilst the space bar is being held down, and then lift up. It's like a walkie-talkie. It works perfectly. So welcome everyone to Chasing Lullabies session 2. However, we are beginning again at the beginning, so it's a great opportunity for anyone who hasn't come to Chasing Lullabies before to get involved. It's a great opportunity for everyone who has already experienced Chasing Lullabies to reconnect. It's lovely to see so many faces here on Zoom this evening. Just double checking, this is the first thing that we all say nowadays is, can you hear me? Can you hear me okay? Thumbs up if you can hear. Great. Okay, fine. Fantastic. If you can't, just put something in the chat. You can always write into the chat any comments, and I'll see them as we're going along. There'll be lots of opportunity to get involved and discuss this evening. We'll have about an hour for the session. And I should suppose just to put one caveat in at the very beginning, which is that, and just a reminder, if anyone does feel like putting on their camera, it's great to see faces. It really helps me to be able to talk to people. So even if you're eating or doing other things, that's great to see people. One thing about Chasing Lullabies on Bereshit, on the very first parsha of the Torah, is that I suppose, I don't know if we should start with the caveat. We'll start with the caveat, which is that one of my favorite Torah writers, someone who writes so deeply, so beautifully about the parsha, his name is Rabbi Mattis Weinberg, and he has a book called Frameworks. And in Frameworks, he begins his section on the book of Bereshit, on the book of Genesis. He begins from Parashat Noach, from the book of Noah. Why? Because he says that actually the parasha that deals with creation is so deep, and there's so much to it, it would need a whole book to deal with rather than just 1 hour or one section, one essay. So sort of caveat that tonight we are going to be dealing with some of the very big questions of life, the universe, and everything. Of course, the answer is 42, but nevertheless, we do have issues as to what the questions are. I love your T-shirt, Mark. So that's in honor of you. I'm mentioning Douglas Adams and the T-shirt. So in any case, Bereshit is a very big topic. So we're going to be starting to scratch the surface this evening, and just kind of a little reminder of what Chasing Lullabies is all about. Maybe I'll start with sort of a personal story. When I was sort of getting more into higher level Jewish learning, for a while I used to think that there was a rabbi who was the most significant rabbi around, because every single shiur, every single Torah lecture I used to go to, this rabbi was quoted. This rabbi was quoted. He was quoted, and this place was quoted, and that place. He had something to say about everything. He must have been the most prolific writer, prolific thinker there ever was known to the face of Jewish knowledge. His name was Chazal. His name was Chazal because every time I go to a Torah lecture, Chazal said this and Chazal said that. I thought Rabbi Chazal must be amazing. Actually, I think I once went into a bookshop and said, "Can I have a book by Chazal, by Rabbi Chazal?" So turns out that Chazal, after you find out a little bit more, that Chazal is an acronym, Chet Zayin Lamed, for Chachamenu Zichronam Livracha, which means our sages of blessed memory. Essentially, when a rabbi wants to quote a source and doesn't quite remember what the source is, you just say Chazal said this, our sages said this, and it's like a blanket for any quote whatsoever. But not having sort of initiated, not having known much about Jewish learning, so there I was thinking Rabbi Chazal was an individual rather than just a blanket statement for all the sages that ever graced the footsteps of history. Which led me to start thinking about Jewish learning in general and how we relate to Jewish learning, because I look around, for example, our shul in Barnet, and I see people who are adults, who are educated, who are thoughtful, who have life experience, who might have degrees, multiple degrees, highly professional positions, whether that's in business or in professions themselves, people who really are living at the top of their game and who are in all other areas of life relating to the domains of their existence in a fully adult and mature way. Well, at least we hope. However, when it comes to Jewish learning, it feels like there is a real barrier here, because many of us, our kind of highest level of learning ended, or formal learning ended somewhere around Cheder time. We've gone to sort of shiurim, we've gone to a few lectures here and there, we've had snippets of information, but we haven't come with some sort of systematic approach to Jewish higher knowledge. And so we walk into shul, we open a Jewish book, and we're transported out of our adult selves into some childlike self, into some Cheder student of 10 years old who is scared that the Rebbe might shout at him, if that was your experience of yesteryear. Some people got little rulers on the fingers. It depends on sort of age. Other people just got very, very bored. So that is where our formal Jewish learning ended. And so there's this kind of real sense of infantilization when we come into shul, which is such a shame. But the truth is, infantilization doesn't just stop there, because let's just read the Torah description of this week's parasha that we just read, the account of creation. And you could argue that that's an infantile story in and of itself. God created the world in 7 days, well, actually 6 days. On the seventh day, he rested. There's a sequence to creation. There's Adam, there's Eve, there's a snake, there's a tree. Christian mythology will have you know that it's an apple. It's not really an apple, but it's a fruit. Anyway, there's all this, and there's so much, this story of original sin, if you're from a Christian perspective, or this story of temptation, of knowledge, of fruit eating and giving in to seduction. It's so inbuilt into our society. I could have pulled up Simpsons pictures with Adam and Eve. I could have pulled up grand artists from the Italian period. I could have pulled up any sort of, there's so much media out there that this is one of the stories that have been given so much airtime. But really, it seems, excuse my language, at first glance, to be an infantile story. You know, Yiska at the moment, our daughter, she's 6 years old, and she's learning it in school, and she's coming home and she's saying it over as the Torah says it out. And God created on this day and created on that day, and he saw it was good, and then there was a snake, and she can dramatize it, she can draw it, but she's relating to it as a 6-year-old. So how do we take what is meant to be a story from the eternal, infinite creator to teach us something about creation, to teach us something about life, the meaning of life, and then translate it through not only the infantile presentation that it has, but also through our more limited Jewish education to update it to a point where we as adults who are seeking spirituality and learning can get meaning from this story. And that's what Chasing Lullabies is about. Chasing Lullabies is where we chase away the lullabies. We as adults ask questions in an adult fashion about these stories, which were written for adults and not just kids. Primarily written for adults, but written in such a way that they can be accessible across the board and written on multiple levels. So we would, one other introduction before we continue is that we've talked about in the past about different types of questions on a text. These are not necessarily my own sort of definitions, but I think they're helpful definitions. Internal questions, external questions, and reflective questions. An internal question is the question that is within the text itself. Something that is so inherent to the text. Maybe it's about the word formation, maybe it's about language use, maybe it's about comparisons between one text and another. Something which is very, very much part of the text itself. An external question is something that arises from the text. So something which arises from the text, it comes out of the text. It's not about the text itself, but it's a question that has to come out from the text. And a reflective question is, how do I feel about this? And I add that personally because I think that in any time that we're engaging with high-level Jewish learning, we need to also think about how it affects us, what it makes us want to do or experience. So that's a reflective question. So just as an example, which will come into next week's parasha, we've shared this example before, which is about Noah. So it says Noah was a righteous man in his generation. Why does the Torah specify he was a righteous man in his generation? Why are we focusing on the context, the historical context of Noah? Why not just say he was a righteous man? There's something perplexing about this righteousness that we're being told about. That's an internal question to the text. There's something about the text itself that doesn't seem to add up. There's an external question. You might call it internal as well because it's so fundamental to the story, but there's an external question as well. And it might even connect to some of the questions we asked today, which is, why would God, after creating the world, decide to destroy it? Sort of, you could say it differently. When we discussed on Shabbat in our sermon, what business leaders and strategists say to their clients, they say, always keep the end in mind. Okay, God, what was the end goal here if after just a few brief years, your 10 generations, you decided enough is enough, the whole world should be destroyed now? If this really was the plan, what was the plan here? Why create all this animal life, all this human life, all this vegetation, only to destroy it with a flood? That's not a question about the text itself. It's not within the text, but it's so fundamental. It comes out of the text. It's an external question. And the final question is a reflective question, which is maybe like, how do I feel about a God that is willing to create nothing, to create something from nothing? He's so willing to bring about the universe, the Big Bang, everything, and then all of a sudden just cause it all to be destroyed again. How do I feel about living in such a kind of vulnerable existence? That's how do I feel about it. It's not a question about God itself. It's not a question about God's plan. It's just how do I feel about the context within which I find myself. Okay, that's my spiel. That's the introduction to Chasing Lullabies. Welcome back, everybody. This week, we are going to be exploring the beginning. In the beginning, Bereshis bara, base, Big Bang. There was a beginning. Now, it's not just the fact that the Torah tells us there was a beginning, but cosmology also tells us there's a beginning. And whether we believe in multiple universes, multiple Big Bangs, billions and billions of iterations of Big Bangs, at least from the perspective that we have of cosmology, there was a beginning, which means there had to be a beginner, something to bring about that beginning, and which is basically the most fundamental and powerful argument for God's existence. Not only that, but then that beginning wasn't just entirely chaotic, but out of beginning came order, came rules of physics, came structure, increasing complexity, and that as time has continued, complexity has only increased until we find ourselves as conscious beings on planet Earth, perfectly ensconced in this little corner of the universe, able to even think about the fact that God exists or doesn't. That's an incredibly complex being. Consciousness is so complex that science has nothing to say about it, because science doesn't understand how consciousness even exists. And so the laws of chaos, the laws of normal sort of order would say that things don't become more and more complex, they become less and less complex, they disintegrate. However, here we have some sort of arc, some sort of direction of the cosmos from a beginning point, and we know there was a beginning, to something which is entirely complex, us sitting here tonight. And so therefore the second argument for intelligent creators, not only that the beginning had to have a beginner, and if the beginning was finite, so the beginner had to be infinite, but not only that, but there was a design to this as well. There's some sort of process which is taking things which are less complex to things which are more complex. So there has to be some intelligent design there too. So those are two very good arguments, which really, other than positing multiple Big Bangs, many billions and billions and billions and billions and billions of Big Bangs, then we're a little bit stuck. I'm not here doing the creation talk, but just a nice statistic that the probability of the complexity of the universe coming to where we are right now, just conscious beings, is 10 to the power of 123. That number is so big that if you were to write that number out on every proton and neutron in the universe, you would still not have enough protons and neutrons in order to fulfill the improbability of us sitting here tonight discussing that, which is basically to say it's not possible without something guiding it, without an intelligent designer. Okay, But we're not here to prove God. We're coming actually probably we're assuming God tonight, and we can have another series about whether it's rational and probable and reasonable and logical to believe in an infinite intelligent designer another time. And then that would also then go on to another discussion about that infinite intelligent designer still being uniquely caring about each and every one of us, in particular the Jewish people, as the people who are going to hold on to morality as in his for him to teach his lessons to the rest of humanity. And there we'd have to talk about mass revelation, but that's another story. Okay, I've just kind of sketched it out. Tonight, what I want to talk about is the story of creation itself. And once we assume there is a creator, and once we assume that he's got some plan for humanity, he's interested in humanity, we have to still ask some very big questions on this parasha. So sometimes it's a bit dangerous to just open up the floodgates of questions, but I think that for Bereshit we can. And so I just want to review what is in this book, this parasha, and then let's just dive into some questions and start to open up the parasha. The parasha begins with the account of creation. There's two actual accounts of the creation of humanity. There's one where humanity is created as a sort of conjoined twin, and then they're separated. And then there's another account where God sees a lonely Adam, and Adam should not be alone, and so he's made a helpmeet is made for him from his side and created into Eve. Adam and Eve then grace the Garden of Eden. There is Shabbat, the first ever Shabbat. Soon after the first ever Shabbat, there is the story in the Garden of Eden with the snake, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that the only thing that Adam may not do, Adam may eat from all the fruits of the tree, and Adam and Eve may eat from all the fruits of the tree of the garden, except for the tree of knowledge between good and evil. There's a snake. This is a walking snake, an incredible walking snake, who seduces Eve somehow. There's some interesting conversation whereby he seduces Eve to eat from the tree, and then she encourages Adam to eat from the tree. They realize that they're naked. They hide from God. God says, "Where are you? Where are you?" And they say, "We're hiding from you because we're naked." "Who told you then that you're naked?" says God. It was, and then there's the whole, "It was the snake." "Oh, it was my wife. It wasn't me." There's the whole blame game. Then God punishes them. They're exiled from the Garden of Eden. There's two fiery cherubs that are left to guard the entrance with a sword, to guard the entrance back into the Garden of Eden. And then Adam and Eve are cursed and go and depart from paradise. They have two sons, Cain and Abel. One of those sons offers a nice sacrifice to God. The other one offers sort of like a mediocre sacrifice to God. The nice sacrifice is accepted, the mediocre sacrifice not so much. There's a bit of jealousy between the two. First instance of fratricide, brother killing brother. And then there's a conversation between God and Cain, who's left. And Cain is also cursed and has to wander the earth. Then there's a whole load of generations, 10 generations, and we record those generations down from Adam through Cain and Abel. Also, now the new child that Adam and Eve have. What does Adam do? One son murdered, another son a murderer. Well, they have another son. They believe in hope. They try again. They have Sheth. They have Seth. Seth carries on the line, and we have the lineage of 10 generations. And finally, we have the introduction of Noah at the end of this week's parasha. Okay, what questions do you have about any of this? Open the floodgates. Internal, external, reflective. Let's go. If you want to unmute yourself, you can press the space bar, or you can just unmute yourself. Burning questions. Very open, very open.
Why was the tree put there in the first place? If there was a tree that they weren't supposed to eat from, why was it put there?
Great question. Why put temptation there? You know, it's like why have an unfiltered internet device in your home? What a ridiculous thing to do. Why put temptation there? Why have the chocolate cake in the house if you don't want to eat chocolate cake? Don't buy chocolate cake. Why put a tree there? Right? Why put a tree there? Good question.
What about the girl children?
Pardon?
Oh, the daughters.
The daughters, right? Why
who aren't mentioned
in these generations of
yes.
And there had to be some girl children because otherwise there wouldn't have been any boy children. So what happened to them? Good. Barry, just jump in, but unmute yourself and jump in.
On a similar theme, if there weren't any other people, if it was only Adam and Eve that had been created, there were no other people, other girls, then the whole of humanity is based on incest, isn't it?
Well, yes. Okay. Glenn? No? Who's that, Danny? Danielle?
Yeah, it's me. Sorry, my camera's not working.
No.
In the story in the Book of Bereshit, I mean, is it really just Adam and Eve, or is there in the first section? Are we talking about more people there?
Great question. And I suppose that question will lead on to other questions about, according to the Torah's the first human, at least, was about 5,760 years ago. So what do we do with all these sort of evidence of Homo neanderthalis, other Homo species prior to Homo sapiens? What do we do with that, and were there other people there? And not only that, but there seems to be something in the Torah itself that there are other people there, because I'll come to you in a second, Jeff, because it says that Cain is worried that other people are going to try and kill him. Who are these other people if it was only mum, dad, Adam, Eve, and two sons, Cain and Abel? Where do they come from? So what's going on there? Jeff?
If the tree of knowledge was the thing that gave Adam and Eve the knowledge of right and wrong, was it not fair to be punished for doing something that he didn't know was a priori right or wrong? Absolutely,
great question. So not only why would we put temptation there, but what does temptation mean in a world where you don't know the difference between good and bad? How can you be punished for choosing bad, for choosing temptation, when you don't have the knowledge of good and bad? Amazing question. Yeah.
Sorry, Rabbi, can I come back a section? So what I actually mean is that the scripture talks about people and multiplying, and then later on it says a mist, and he made Adam from the dust. But beforehand, it mentions people were multiplying. So that's what I actually mean. But were Adam and Eve maybe the first people to actually have a neshama and given a purpose? And did Hashem actually make other people at the same time? But they just were, let's say, soulless or.
Right. So I think there's what you're referring to there, Daniel, is that there are two different accounts of creation, chapter 1 and chapter 2, and those do differ. But I think there's an additional concept which is kind of alongside that, which is what do we do about any sense of there being other people, other Homo species around. I have a personal theory which I haven't necessarily backed up with other texts, which is that we understand that there was something called a cognitive revolution around about the time that we see the emergence of this story. The cognitive revolution being the point that Homo sapiens really became a dominant thinking species, and not just one of the other Homo species, Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalis, other Homo species, and that at that point there was a certain brain development which would be the physical manifestation of spiritual change called a neshama, and that therefore there were other Homo-like species around, but it was at this point that Adam got in the neshama. I'm not going to be focusing on that too much tonight because that's very much an external question. It's sort of like outside of the system a little bit, but I am very much interested in some of these. But it's something which we should definitely talk about and keep on the cards.
Can I ask?
Okay, so I'm gonna. It's really exciting because the questions are stimulating a lot of people. So now I'm going to choose people. So I will just go by the order of that I saw people interested, and then so I'll shout out. So Michael, I think you wanted to ask something first.
Question. It's more of a statement. Basically, eating from the tree of knowledge is like a sliding doors situation. You do eat from the tree of knowledge, or you don't. And what would have happened if they didn't eat from the tree of knowledge? If they had the seichel, basically, not to eat from the tree of knowledge, they could have stayed in the Garden of Eden, couldn't they?
Great. Yeah. So Michael, that's a great question. So what would have the other option be? It's almost like they were fated to eat from the tree of knowledge. That's not fair, is it? Or is it? That's a good question. Okay. What would the other option have been?
Basically, that they were destined to eat from the tree.
Or as my rabbi in Israel liked to put it, he said it's a setup. It was a setup.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we'll talk about that. That's definitely something that I'd like to expand upon. I think our former chairman, Russell, and then our current chairman, Simon, mazel tov, both of you, and thank you very much, both of you. I'm not going to do any sort of thank yous now, but yes, so Russell.
Thanks. Certainly aligned to the question about other people.
do we know, sort of in terms of the animals, the birds, the fish that are all created, do we know how many of each species was created? Was it just one? Was it two? You know, 2 by 2 going to the next part with Noah, or was it, you know, with any infinite number?
That's a good question. Yeah, it's a good question. I'm just going to hold some. I'm not going to respond to all of them, but yes, it's good. So, what did creation look like? You could also ask it slightly differently, Russell. Further, is how was matter organized? You know, when there was the initial Big Bang, how did matter then start to coalesce? And so there was light and there's dark. There's how does it all? You know, not just the arrangement of species, but the arrangement of the bits of the species too. Okay, Simon.
So I'll be quick, but I've got 3 things I want to just ask. So the first is the third line starts with God said, let there be light. We know, or we assume he's talking to angels, but, you know, there's no mention of why he's speaking. Like there's nothing for him to speak to. Seems quite a childish imagery of God speaking to me. And throughout creation, God's speaking. The second is quite textual. So it's at the creation of man. So God created man in his image, in the image of God. He created him, male and female. He created them. Doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. And then the third is to do with the flame of the ever-turning sword, which I want to know why we don't go looking for it. Where is it? And why do we never think about the tree of life? Because God seems very agitated that if he left man in the Garden of Eden, that he'd find the tree of life and become immortal. But why, you know, there's plenty of people looking for immortality throughout history. Why has no one searched for the tree of life and the ever-turning sword?
Very good. Like, can you hear me, by the way? It sounds like, can you hear me? You can't hear me.
Your sound has reduced, but
1 second. Is that better? Great. Okay. So 3 questions. The first question was about speech, God speaking. The second question was about male and female who created. He created him, then he created them. That dual account almost within there of God creating some joined man and woman. And then the third question was about why aren't we searching for immortality? So the two first questions are very interesting internal questions. I'm not going to address them all tonight, but hopefully the third one about the cherubs we will deal with further this evening. Joe, you had also wanted to ask something. Then I'm going to start exploring because otherwise we're not going to make any headway. But I'm really appreciating all these questions. Joe.
I wasn't going to ask anything. I was going to go down the road that you don't want to go down of the other people and the theories that I've heard about it. So we probably leave that because you don't want to open that one up now.
Okay, but I think it's something which is really interesting. And any look, I made it. I was a bit naughty and extreme at the beginning, which is I said, of course you have to believe in God. You have to understand there was an infinite intelligent designer when I began. And I've said, of course, Judaism has some sort of monopoly on truth because of mass revelation. But then I didn't deal with the very tricky part called the creation story, which is, if you read it as in a fundamentalist way, very problematic. So I sort of quite carefully, not quite carefully, but slightly breezed over that topic. I think we will have to have a separate series and separate thinking about how we, as people who do say that, of course, there's an intelligent design, of course, the Jews have this mission and that God selected us and cares about us. Nevertheless, how we read this as Orthodox Jews, not as revisionist ones. So that's a good question, and we'll come back to it. Okay, so but there was one question which I thought we might have focused on a bit more, which is almost sort of standing back from this whole piece and saying, why did God do this? So far, all questions so far assumed, and it's not a criticism, but all questions so far assume that God did do this. God did create the world. So and that there must have been some reason. But what was the reason? Why would God create the world? What is the meaning of life, the universe, and everything? That maybe that's a fundamental question. Why was there a Big Bang? Why wouldn't infinity just be kind of happy being infinity? And then I think all the other questions then get nested underneath that, which is that then if infinity has a plan, so then how does that plan seem to play out in the bizarre workings of the Garden of Eden, in the temptation, in Jeff's question about how can they even know about good and evil? How can you expect them to know about good and evil if they haven't ever tasted from the tree? How can you hold them culpable? And then everything sort of starts to deteriorate. And it's on that, and you could also then pull the zoom lens back a little bit further also, which is this parsha called creation, called Bereshit, has a number of distinct parts: creation, Garden of Eden, Cain and Abel, and all the way down through the generations, the male generations, to Noah. So also you could ask, how does it all fit together? Is there some sort of pattern repeating within the parsha itself? Does Cain and Abel, for example, say anything else about about other parts of the parsha, or is that an isolated story on its own? So I'm going to start to sort of sketch out some ideas this evening using the text, and what I'm going to rely on as my caveat at the beginning, which is that this parsha is so big that we really can only scratch the surface. But what I want us to do is start to feel some dynamics of Bereshit, of creation, that we will then continue to explore as a repeated pattern throughout the book of Bereshit. It's almost going to be like our leitmotif as we go through. So let's begin, maybe slightly unexpectedly, by looking at the story of Cain and Abel, because there's something there that that might hold a clue to understanding what's going on with maybe some of the more famous parts of the parasha. So I'm just going to do a screen share, and I just wanted to share with you the verses. As you can find, there's an amazing program online called Safaria. I don't know if any of you use it. It's safaria.org, and you can find almost every single Hebrew text on there, a lot of them with not only English translation, but also commentaries. So here we are, we're in chapter 4 of Genesis, and we're talking about, we're in the middle of the Cain and Abel story. That in verse 8, chapter 4, that Cain said to his brother Abel, and when they went, and there's like this break, and when they were in the field, Cain set upon his brother Abel and killed him. So he stumbled upon his brother in this act of frustration and jealousy. He kills his brother. Vayomer Hashem el Cain. We're in verse 9 now, chapter 4, verse 9. Vayomer Hashem el Cain, Ei Hevel achicha. Where's Hevel, your brother? Where is Abel? Vayomer lo yadati. I don't know. Hashomer achi anochi. Famous line. Am I my brother's keeper? Right. And he said, and then we carry on. Vayomer ma'asisa. And then God says, what have you done? Kol demei achicha tze'akim alai min ha'adama. The voice of the blood of your brother is calling out to me from the ground. Va'ata orur ata min ha'adama. And now you are cursed. You should be cursed from the ground. Asher pasas piha, which opened its mouth like kachas as to take, to receive your brother's blood from your hand. Ki sa'avoid es ha'adama. Because if you, when you work the ground, lo so safe taste koicha loch. It shall not give its strength to you, not v'nod tieva aretz. You should become a wanderer on the earth. Cain said to God, I can't bear this punishment. You've sent me out, you've banished me from the face of the earth, and I must hide from you. And I'm going to be a wanderer on the earth. Anyone who finds me is going to kill me. Okay, so before we carry on, we're going to play a little game. Where have you heard any of this before? Where have you heard similar echoes to the conversation that Cain has with God somewhere else in the Torah, or a similar, and I'll give you a clue, in this week's parsha? And what are those similarities?
Well, it's all to do with the apple and the serpent.
Go on.
Well, They also did something wrong. God says he's going to punish them.
Okay, so there's a sin by the eating of the tree of knowledge from good and evil. There's a punishment. Go further. What other comparisons are there? Even more specific.
Going to be expelled from the Garden of Eden.
So there's an expulsion from the Garden of Eden, which is paralleled with Cain's expulsion from society. Great, you're now expelled from society. What else?
Hashem also says, where are you? He's asking, like he does with Adam and Eve.
Very good. So God says to Adam and Eve, Ayeka, where are you? They're hiding, right? Because they know they're naked. And God says to Cain, he says, where's your brother? There's this sense of something being concealed from God, and God trying to, well, not God striking through that and saying, what's going on here? What else? What about the form of the punishment? What's the punishment that Adam gets when he's expelled from the garden?
He has to work.
He has to work the land. What's the punishment that Cain gets? It's a further intensification of that. Not only does he have to work, but the land is never going to look after him. Any other comparisons? Any other similarities between this story of Cain? We've got so far a sin where there's a concealment with a question from God. Where are you? We've got a response. What about the response? How do Eve and Adam respond initially when they're challenged by God that you ate from the tree? Do they say, "Yeah, I did. I fess up"?
No, somebody else's fault.
Oh, somebody else's fault. They're pushing off responsibility. What does Cain do when he's challenged? Where's your brother?
Nothing to do with me, Gav.
Nothing to do with me, Gav. Am I my brother's keeper? There's an abrogation of responsibility in both cases.
They're passing the buck, basically.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So there's hiding, there's passing the buck, there's searching. There is a punishment where the ground is cursed, and there's an expulsion from their home. So there's clearly lots of connections, but there are some differences too. In the case of Adam and Eve, even though they're passing the buck from one to the other, there is an acknowledgement that there's been a sin. Whereas Cain says, "I don't even know what you're talking about. Am I my brother's keeper? I don't have no. It's almost like I totally divorce myself from this situation over here." We already mentioned that there's a difference between the ground being cursed for Adam, where he's going to have to work it, whereas the ground being cursed for Cain, where not only is he going to have to work it, but the ground is never going to produce something for him. So it seems like the parallels are there, but there's an intensification when we get to Cain. Okay. So what does that tell us about? So we've made a parallel. What does that parallel tell us? And why would this be happening? What is this set up? What is the situation that is being set up for Adam and Eve to fail with temptation to the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and the setup with Cain and Abel to be set up to further entrench a world of sin? So here I want to introduce an idea, and then we're going to come back to the text. The idea I'm going to introduce is an idea that we began to introduce on Shabbat, but it's something that I think we need to expand upon, and we're not going to do justice tonight, but hopefully as we have more and more iterations, if we see this idea, we're going to see it in all its glory over time. And that really comes back to the very fundamental question, which is, why would God create a universe? Why would God, an infinite being, decide to create finitude? There's all sorts of questions. How can finitude exist alongside infinity? That's another question. But here we're just simply asking why? Why would God want to create an existence? Our sages tell us, Chazal tell us, Rabbi Chazal tell us. If you think about it, why would infinity want to do that? So it seems that the only reason infinity wants to do that is he wants to give of himself to something else. So God has to create something finite to give of himself to. I'm using the language himself only because that's a convenience and because I'm a man. If I was a woman, I'd probably say give of herself. But I don't want this to be a gendered thing. Just God has to give of itself. This being called God, infinity, decides that it somehow wants to convey something beneficial upon something else. What is the, so therefore existence needs to be brought into being in order for something to be a beneficiary. I can't have a recipient of my goodness without there being something to receive. So finite existence has to come about, which almost means that we have a complete unified whole, and then there's a separation. There's something which gets drawn, which doesn't get drawn out from it, but there's a separation between infinity, which is encompassing everything, and then there's something which is finite existence, which has to be part of infinity but can't be part of infinity at the same time. There's some sort of separation. What is the greatest gift that infinity can give to something else? It's the gift of infinity. It's the gift of coming back to infinity itself. Because if infinity is everything, if infinity is all good and all loving, which maybe some assumptions I'm making here, that there's a beneficence in infinity. So then in order for infinity to offer something meaningful, the best thing that infinity can offer is infinity itself, because it's the greatest good, it's the greatest love, it's the greatest truth. I know I'm making a lot of assumptions by equating all those three things, but just roll with me here for a second. So therefore there is a process now of separation and return. That infinity has to create a separation, has to create finite existence. There's from that unification, from that unity of all, there is a separation into small parts. You could almost think about it as a huge explosion of matter, that matter is now everywhere. And then there has to be a unification again, whereby somehow matter coalesces, not only in such a way that it's meaningful, but also that it can reattach to infinity. So it's a journey of individuation and then coming back. That journey of individuation and separation and then return, we see its beginnings in this week's parasha. Initially, humanity is created in a paradise which is unparalleled. Humanity is in this glorious place, and sort of Michael asked, well, what would have happened if they'd just been left there? Well, let me ask you, if you're just given something free where you don't have to work for it, how good do you feel about that? Do you feel good? Do you feel amazing? Do you feel really accomplished, really achieved? Like you've really achieved something? Like the kids that got their GCSEs for free or their A-levels for free this summer, how do they feel about that? Okay, that's nice, like I don't have to work for it, but do they actually feel a sense of internal inherent accomplishment in everything they do, that they stayed up slogging away, revising, making their revision notes, their mind maps, all the different things that people do? I'm not sure, and maybe this is my own assumption, I'm not sure that it feels as good as having put in all that work and all that effort and bleary-eyed going into that exam and pouring your brains out onto that piece of paper and finally getting the results on results day and seeing you did it. It paid off. All that effort paid off. That is a real feeling of pleasure. But to simply be given a gift in one's hand, I'm not sure that it's as delicious, as exquisite. We could take that into a different context. Imagine being given the perfect relationship, if there is such a thing. The perfect relationship. It's all entirely worked out. You marry someone, you have a friendship with someone, you have a child, and it's entirely perfect. It goes according to the book. You say the right things, you're entirely sensitive, the other person picks up on your nonverbal cues. Everything is entirely right. Everything is entirely there. Would that feel as good as having gone through all the different permutations of what relationship means, of learning about each other, of discussing, of arguing, of fighting, of making up, of learning again and learning more and more discussing and more conversations and more thinking and more experiences and more sharing, until now at that point, then you finally can understand what it means to preempt the other person, to be sensitive to the other person's needs, to have integrated the other. So I don't know about you, but I think that it's much more pleasurable to feel the benefit, to feel the fruits of one's labor, rather than simply being given things on a plate. If anyone wants to disagree at this point, then I'm happy. But this is quite an assumption for me. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe other people disagree. Anyone feel
I think through the eyes of now, I can agree with you. But through the eyes of Adam and Eve, or however many people we decide were created, they didn't know that they'd been given paradise, because there's no, like Jeff was saying, there's no comparison. So it's an unfair assumption.
Yeah, so that's a good point.
And life would be really boring if we never had any problems, because if everything was so perfect, it wouldn't be right, would it?
Right. So that's an interesting point. I think and maybe this comes on to the question that Jeff asked, which is that if they didn't know good and evil, how can we hold them accountable for eating from the tree? It must be, therefore, that they knew some level they had some level of knowledge, but their level of knowledge was different. That their level of knowledge was it is correct to follow the advice, to follow the instruction of my creator. It is incorrect not to follow the instruction of my creator. That's not about whether it's good or bad. Maybe it's about true or false. If infinity has told me my creator, right? Who was Adam's dad? Adam's dad was God. There was no belly button. There was an entire understanding over here that God has told me, my dad has told me that this is the only fruit I may not have. Why would God create a temptation? Why would, right, that question that we had, why would God create a temptation? Just leave the chocolate cake out of the garden. So I suppose the answer there is that God wants to have a relationship with the things that he creates. How does he have a relationship with the things that he creates? Is that those things that he creates respect him enough to care about what he cares about. They have that knowledge. They have the knowledge that dad cares about this, so I should care about this, because that's what a relationship is. Relationship is caring about what the other person cares about. So it's not necessarily on the same world of good and evil, but it is a relationship based on, I understand that this is true and this is, and therefore not, or that is not true. Simon.
But from God's perspective, if he wants to have a relationship with something, if that something doesn't have free will, it's not going to be a very interesting relationship.
And actually, it's not only not interesting for God, it's not interesting for the individual themselves.
Exactly. So in order for Adam to have free will, he needed to eat the fruit from the tree.
So this is the setup that we were talking about, which is that if Adam wants to deepen his relationship with God, he almost feels that he has to increase the stakes, increase the challenge. It's not enough just to respect that one point of truth versus falsity. Don't eat from this tree. I actually would like to be plunged into a world of relative morality, because then I have greater individuation, greater separation. Now, the greater the individuation, all the more delicious it will be to come back. All the more powerful it will be to have achieved it of my own choice, of my own morality, that I have integrated godliness into me. So in the world of paradise, where godliness is all around, how much integration can there be? Because there's how much separation is there when we're at this stage. I'm not very separate from God at all. Actually, the Medrash talks about Adam as this almost godlike individual. And Simon quoted the line in this week's parasha, which we have to understand. If he eats from the tree of life, he'll be like me. There's some idea that Adam is created on such a level that the separation between God and humanity is very minimal. And so then Adam says, well, how much can I really integrate? How much can I really come close? I'd like to be more separate. I'd like to have the opportunity for separation. So that's coming back to Simon's question, the other Simon's question, Simon Hayes' question, which is, well, what could Adam know? Well, Adam can know that there will be a greater test in a world of relativity than in a world of objectivity. So let me select that. It's almost being set up to select that and to have this sin, in order that I should pull even further away, because the challenge is greater, the GCSE is bigger, the relationship needs more work, but then ultimately the fruits will be so much better. It's a setup. But what did we see when we were investigating the parasha and the comparisons between Cain and Abel and the story of eating from the tree of knowledge, which is that every test has also a possible poor outcome, which is that ultimately, every time you individuate away from God, every time you separate, that's also breaking something down that needs to be overcome. And this is the tricky dilemma. Every time a person pulls back and pulls apart, yes, overcoming it means I'm coming closer, but there is also a breakdown in the process. It's like on a very basic physiological level, in order to get stronger, in order for muscle to get stronger, it needs to be ripped apart and broken, and then it has to be repaired. And so we're seeing in the beginning of creation, this descent into sin, this pulling away, and we actually haven't found the resolution yet. In this week's Parsha, all we've seen is the splintering and individuation. We haven't seen the return. However, there is an echo of that return. There is an echo of that return in Simon's third question he asked this evening, which was about the cherubs. And with this, I want to just finish with one more little short presentation, and then we'll take some comments at the end. Let me pull up the verse of the cherubs, and because this will hold within it, there's a secret within this parsha, which almost kind of it maps out what the return, what the pull away and then the reintegration could look like for us in a post sin world. So back into Sepharia. Let me just put it up, and I'll just show you what Sepharia looks like if anyone's interested in coming into it in the future. So can you see, this is the homepage you land on when you come into Sepharia, and it has all the different texts that you can choose. So here I want to choose on the written law, on Tanakh, and I choose Genesis. I click on Genesis at the top, I click on chapter 3, because that's where I would like to go. And we want to go to Genesis 3, chapter 24. So scroll down to chapter 24. Okay, so here we are. Vaigaresh Adam, and he drove out man. Again, that language of Gerushin, of Goresh, which is the same word which was used to describe what happens to Cain, that he was also literally means divorced. He was divorced from the land. Vaigaresh Adam, that he drove out humanity. Vayashkein mikedem legan Eden, and he literally yashkein, he positioned, he caused to rest at the east of the Garden of Eden. Es akruvim, the cherubs, the es lahat hacherev hamisapeches, and the fiery, ever-turning sword, lishmoer as derech eitz chaim, to guard the way back to the tree of life. And so here comes Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, maybe the Deathly Hallows, who knows, that he who must not be named is looking for eternity. How the fiery cherubs are guarding eternity. They're guarding an eternal life. But let's just look at these cherubs for a second, because the cherubs hold a little secret, actually quite a substantive secret. Where else in the Torah have you heard of cherubs? There's only one other place in the Torah that there are cherubs.
There's two of them on top of the Mishkan, isn't there?
Very good, Mishkan. There are two of them in the Mishkan. They are inside. They're on top of the Ark.
On top of it, yeah.
That's right. I've never actually seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, but the Ark of the Covenant might have looked like something like this, that you've got two cherubs on top of the Ark. So in as much as there were cherubs guarding the Garden of Eden, the only other time you find cherubs in the Torah is in the tabernacle, in the Mishkan, and they are on top of the Ark. Now let's just think about that even more. Look at this word over here in the text, Vayashkein, and God calls them literally to be stationed or to dwell. What does that sound like, that Vayashkein?
God.
Not God, Vayashkein. What word is that?
To remember?
Cain.
No, where? I'll give you a clue. Where were these other angels stationed? They were stationed in the
Mishkan.
Mishkan. It's the same word, Vayashkein, which is from the word Shekhinah, the presence, the divine presence, which is resting. He calls them to rest at the Garden of Eden. They rest in the Mishkan. They rest in the place of God's presence, of his Shekhinah, of his presence, which rests. So it's the same words, it's the same root. And as final thing, which is interesting, which is what are these these cherubs? What are they guarding? They're guarding the way to the tree of
Life.
Tree of life. Okay. What are the angels in the Mishkan? What are they looking after?
The word of God. Source of life.
Ooh. So 1 second. They're looking after what's in the ark that they're on top of?
The Ten Commandments.
10 Commandments. Very good. They're in the 10 Commandments. Do we ever describe the Torah? Well, the 10 Commandments are the representations of the Torah. Do we ever describe the Torah in any terminology which might be familiar to us over here? Something about Eitz HaChaim, tree of life.
Oh, yes.
Sorry, I lost you. Who was that?
Eitz Chaim He.
Eitz Chaim He l'machazikim ba. Right, choose your tune. Eitz Chaim He. Where is that? That's in Proverbs. So just to show you, what would we do? We'd go back to our search. We'd go into Tanakh. We'd go down into writings. We'd find Proverbs. We'd go into chapter 3. And we go to verse 18. And there it is. Eitz Chaim Hi l'machazikim ba v'somechem u'ushar. It's a tree of life to those who grasp her, and whoever holds onto her is happy. What's that referring to? That's referring to the Torah. So the cherubs, which were in the Garden of Eden, which are described as resting there, the same language of Mishkan, are guarding the tree of knowledge. Well, there's another set of cherubs which are not in the Garden of Eden. Now they're on top of the ark in the Mishkan, in the place that God's presence rests. They're guarding another Eitz Chaim, another tree of life. They're guarding the Torah. And so, if you want to know how to come back from ultimate splintering and individuation and return to paradise and return to a tree of life, which provides eternity, which provides immortality. So Simon said, why are people not searching for immortality? The answer is that immortality is right here in the good book. That's what we're being told. Why? Why is immortality in the good book? How does learning Torah make me immortal? So, in a nutshell, Shoshan and I had a recent conversation. We were talking about someone we'd heard about who had been diagnosed with a terminal disease, and I threw out one of my flippant comments, which was, well, I suppose life is terminal, isn't it? So life is terminal. The very fact of life is that it is terminal, but there are ways that we can attach life to something which is eternal, to something that will last forever. If you want to know how to get eternity, it's not necessary to look for the elixir of life, the sorcerer's stone, or the deathly hallows. The way to eke out eternity in this terminal life, in this finite life, is to hold on to eternity, to hold on to infinity. God gave us, which is the return to God, the return to attaching to God, the attaching every moment of this terminal existence to eternity. That makes each moment last forever. And so if you want to know why God created the world, he created the world to give his goodness to us. What's the greatest goodness? It's the goodness which is earned. How is goodness earned? It's by allowing us and affording us the opportunity to splinter off, to individuate to a huge extent, and then to overcome that separation, that sin, and come close again. What would that look like? That would look like the path that the cherubs have guarded, a path which is paved with Torah, which is a path of making each moment good and last forever. I'm done. Thank you for chasing away the lullabies with me this evening. We've just scratched the surface of this book, but let's focus for the next, maybe even for the rest of the book of Bereshit, on this journey of pulling apart and coming close again. We're going to see it so many times. We're going to see a world in next week's parasha which is once again challenged, that it's pulled apart to such an extent it needs to make a repair. What is the repair? What is the pulling apart of the flood and the repair of the post-diluvian world? Then we move into families which are ripped apart. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob's family is entirely ripped apart. The rest of the narrative of Bereshit, from when we get to Joseph and Jacob is the entire Joseph story: brother against brother, father losing son, and then family reunited, pulling apart and then coming together once again. Thank you very much for joining me on this journey, and I'm really interested to hear any thoughts and comments now as we come to the end of the evening.
Sure.
Interesting.
Rabbi, it strikes me. I love the concept. And what I'm going to say isn't really about the concept at all, but I'm a pedant. So, when did God create the cherubim and the angels that He was talking to at the beginning?
That's a great question. What was there? Was that Bereshit bara? Was it part of the time? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. I'm sure there are texts that deal with when the heavenly spheres were created, but I will get back to you on that one.
So a couple of comments. One is that you seem to be suggesting that sin is a good thing in order that we can then repent it. Generally,
okay.
So it's not a bad thing to sin. The other was just whether you, if you have time, whether you could go over something you said in your talk, I think just before Rosh Hashanah, about just the word Bereshis and the link to the Akedah.
So Jonathan, I'll get back to you privately about that one. I now know who sent that message onto my wife.
Lovely, that was me. Yeah.
So I'll get back to you on that one. Your first question was, sorry.
It seems to be a good thing to sin.
Oh, very nice. So I think that the way that I understand that is that we don't seek out sin, but sin seems to be a reality that we deal with, and it is a dimension of life. We might redefine sin as missing the mark or falling short, or I like missing the mark better. The word chait comes from is used in the writings to describe when an archer misses his target. So we know that we get lost on this path of life. God has to will every moment into existence. This is getting sort of slightly to the edges of Torah philosophy, but I'm I enjoy this area. So God must have willed sin into the world as well. Like nothing is outside of God. It's not like there's a satanic force which is outside of the world of God. No, we have God, and God is everything. So sin is a necessary part of life. Do we celebrate sin? No. Do we want to come into a world? Do we want to be tested? No, because tests are difficult. So we'd all rather not have to sit the test. But once you're in the test, then enjoy the ride, because that's how we grow. So I think that's sort of the balance over there. Yeah. Okay.
Rabbi, can I ask one thing?
Yeah.
I've actually, and you may have answered it tonight, because I've always wondered why, after receiving the Torah, we're told no idols, no idol worship. It's like a really big part of our religion, no idol worship, and then we receive it, and then we make these cherubim on top, which are ultimately, if you took them away and put them somewhere, they'd be idols. So are we saying that the only reason why the cherubim were there on top of the ark is because of the reason that we've discussed tonight, or was there another purpose?
That's a great question. We have to work out what the graven images are. I don't think they're attempting to make a graven image of God. They're attempting to make an image of an angel, which might be something slightly different. In a similar way, you can have pictures of animals and other things in a shul, like we have in stained glass windows with the deer and the gazelle. So I think that there's a kind of a localized question about what constitutes making an idol or not. It's a good question. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to say thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. I hope to see you again next week, 8 p.m. Monday night. Shkoyach.
Shkoyach, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
Oh, yeah.